Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 26th, where we are in the midst of talking about Frankenstein, a text that has never been out of print, so somehow it has captured audience imaginations. In part, I suggest, because of the 1930s film. And as many of you indicated, that 1930s film is a completely different entity than the text itself. I think of it as, in fact, two different stories that have their own merit. The problem, I suppose, is trying to rely on the film to understand the text, because not only is the film radically different in terms of plot, but it also exchanges or switches the names between Victor and Henry. If we think about how Victor is a very German sounding name, for the 1930s, that would be very politically delicate to have a main character with a German sounding name, which is one of the main reasons why the name switch occurred, in my opinion. That said, I think also what's interesting about the film is in the credits, Mrs. Percy Shelley is attributed as the author of Frankenstein, which says a great deal about how gender was viewed in the 1930s. And I think that this particular text oftentimes is surprising because a female female is the primary, more than primary, a female is the author of this text. We had talked about how Percy Shelley had assisted her with some of the edits, but ultimately she wrote this tale and was able to be published. A tale that's quite dark, and that said, I think it also is an examination of what happens in society when female is excluded. And that perhaps is even darker than anything that Victor could try to attempt, which is to create life from death. And Victor's attempt to do so not only is unnatural, but it usurps the natural power of female, and it also usurps the power of God. Hence, one of the reasons why the full title of the text is Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. So we discussed Prometheus being the Greek mythological figure who was punished for stealing fire from the gods and giving that to humanity. He's punished for his hubris, and we'll see throughout the text how Victor as well is punished for his hubris by attempting to take on the role of a god. We also see as well literary references to things like Milton's Paradise Lost and Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. And as I had indicated, we're going to have to suspend some disbelief here in that it just so happens that the creature not only is able to teach itself to read, but it reads some of the most complex literary texts in existence and understands them, including Paradise Lost. But nevertheless, we can see the parallels, even if we've never read Paradise Lost or Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. So I had indicated Paradise Lost is a great epic poem by John Milton about the fall of man, but it's more really about showing a certain level of empathy towards Satan. And that made the poem somewhat scandalous, but also it fits in quite nicely with this figure of a creature that is created and then abandoned. And that probably is Victor's biggest flaw. Certainly creating a life from death is one of Victor's biggest mistakes. But the bigger error, the bigger action of monstrosity, if you will, happens to be Victor's neglect and abandonment of his creation. And you can think of all kinds of modern day parallels. Not that Mary Shelley was aware of some of the ways that science would progress over time, but think about the idea of unnaturally creating life. And we could think about something like cloning, for instance, or even artificial insemination. And certainly the idea of parental responsibility towards child is something that we grapple with in our current society. And of course, we have sympathy and empathy for the child that isn't given guidance, much like we're supposed to have sympathy and empathy for the creature who isn't given guidance. But eventually, regardless of that entity's upbringing, that entity has to take a certain level of responsibility for itself. And of course, we see that the creature ultimately is unable to reconcile its feelings of revenge and grief. So, what we see is a complex tale here where we don't necessarily see any good versus evil. We see multiple shades of gray. The epistolary novel technique complicates things even further because ultimately all we're getting is Walton's retelling of the entire story, even though it's very easy to forget that and believe that we are embedded in Victor's narrative or even the creature's narrative. But we never get the creature's narrative and we never get Victor's narrative. We only get Walton's retelling of those. So you've got narrative embedded with a narrative embedded with a narrative, something that the film is unable to do, or at least doesn't attempt to do. It's not an easy thing to do something like that on film, and it certainly would have added to the length of the film. So I think those are probably the primary reasons why the film made the decision, much like it made the decision to do the name swap between Victor and Henry for a main character because Victor sounded so German. So there are, Hollywood forces at play when we see something like the very iconic 1930s Frankenstein. But I was quite pleased in the discussion forum responses about how many of you said that you enjoyed the film, despite its age and even despite the fact that it was shot in black and white. I always thought there was a kind of artistic beauty to black and white, the ability to use shadow and dark and light being a theme in the text. So, as I had indicated, you're not required to respond to your peers' observations in the discussion forum, but you are required to read their observations and also my responses to them as well. So, I should be all caught up with the discussion forum questions at this point. As you know, we had a blackout at GCC, or a power loss, and that kind of led to some glitches with the Moodle system, but everything has been solved, and I believe I'm all up to date now with our class discussion forum questions. One of the things that I wanted to suggest are the parallels between Victor and Walton. This would make a great paper topic, by the way, or a great journal topic, and that they're both very similar and that they both have ambition. They're trying to do that which no man has done before. They both have hubris, arrogance. They're both isolated and they're both lonely. And in the world of the Gothic, being isolated is always a bad thing. And this is, as Stephen King said in Danse Macabre, very much like a morality tale. And Gothic literature oftentimes is a morality tale where a lesson is taught, where in the early forms of morality tales in medieval times, these were biblical stories that were retold to give a lesson. And there are definitely lessons within the text of Frankenstein. And even though we have central male characters, I think there also is a lesson about gender and what happens when female is excluded from male world, and ultimately horrible things happen. And Mother Nature could, in fact, be seen as perhaps our central character. And if nature is indeed feminine, then we could say that Mary Shelley gave us a text with a central female character. But even if not, I think it's very clear that this text is supposed to make a commentary on its society and should be a cautionary tale for us. As I think a couple of you observed in the discussion forum responses, Victor's loss of his mother was probably a major impetus for his desire to try to create life from death. But that said, Victor was always taken by hubris and arrogance. And when he's consulting with the Philosopher's Stone and Cornelius Agrippa, those are definitely occult and supernatural references. One of the ways that I always point to this text being more of a Gothic text than a science fiction text, the distinction being, of course, is that a supernatural text is something that cannot be accomplished through the science of the time. Unlike science fiction, where it could be accomplished, if not through the science of the time, the science of the future. But we had talked about genre blending and how this text tends to straddle both of them. But if you know anything about Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, you know that the Philosopher's Stone is supposed to bring everlasting life, which of course fits into the idea of Victor trying to play God and reanimating death into life. Cornelius Agrippa was a great famous occultist at the time period. So that in and of itself lends itself to the Gothic, as well as the setting. It's very macabre. We see doubling. In fact, we could see that we could suggest that Victor and the creature are basically doubles of one another, much like a father and a son. We could also say that Walton and Victor are doubles of one another, both of them taking the same path. The sense of ambiguity, this possibility that yes, we've got a supernatural tale, but of course it could perhaps be explained through possible scientific methods. Not that Mary Shelley understood something about cloning again, or perhaps something about artificial insemination, but there's certainly enough parallels there. Death, rebirth, isolation, just the setting of that famous creation scene, as I had talked about last class, I think is very important. And we had talked a little bit about the opening chapters, the first 9 chapters, and the chapter 5 creation scene. And ultimately, that led to the creature story, an articulate creature. And we see the issues of nature versus nurture. It seems that the creature is born good, but its environment, so its nature is good, but it's nurtured, or its environment is what turns it evil. Unlike the film, where the explanation is supposed to be the abnormal brain that is used mistakenly in its creation. That said, I've always thought that Boris Karloff gave a very sympathetic portrayal of the creature, and that we, despite the abnormal brain, can't feel a certain level of empathy when the creature is tortured, for instance, by Fritz. With fire. And of course, that hunchback has become such a cliche in Gothic literature, such a trope. But that was something that was established through film, as we see. That wasn't Mary Shelley's initial vision. The creature appreciates nature. Nature is portrayed as a good in the story. Engages in benevolent activities. Teaches itself language, no small trick. So obviously it's got a great amount of intelligence. Uses reason and is able to compare itself both to Adam and Satan once it's able to read Paradise Lost, and realizes that its creator has abandoned it, much like perhaps God abandoned both Satan, who was the most beautiful angel in heaven, and Satan laments the idea that ultimately he's punished for his beauty and for his desire to show his beauty when a fickle God decides to pay more attention to his new creation, Adam, which is one of the reasons why Satan corrupts Adam, at least in the story. And in chapter 11, when we get the creature story, we're introduced to the DeLacy family. And this is something that we do not see at all in the film. And the DeLacy family allows us to play with the theme of vision and blindness, and that the matriarch or the patriarch of the family is blind. And of course, the creature is initially rejected because of its hideous appearance, not because of its actions. So this idea of bias or prejudice is quite progressive, I think, for Mary Shelley's text. That said, I've often thought that her text is also very Eurocentric, which is troublesome. And of course, she is a product of her time. And we even see that with the DeLacy family as well, when outsiders are introduced, that the assumption is that the European has a certain level of superiority or sophistication. But at any rate, blind DeLacy cannot see, so therefore there is a possibility, if the creature were to be able to form a connection with DeLacy first, that perhaps he would be accepted by DeLacy and then ultimately the family as a whole. And we see that that isn't the case. And we get this long, convoluted story about how the family was exiled, and it used to have a certain level of privilege and it no longer does, and that ultimately they need to fend for themselves. We find out that it has something to do with Felix, how ultimately he tried to defend in righteous indignation someone who he felt had been unjustly accused and basically was double crossed. Felix was promised for his assistance Safety, which was the daughter of the accused. And that would not be uncommon, where female would be viewed as kind of property to be given or to be bestowed upon. We even see that with Victor himself when he first considers Elizabeth, and how ultimately that she will eventually be his bequeathed, and that's his parents' intent. Saifi's mother, though, was a Christian Arab, so this allows some commentary here about religion as well as commentary about culture. And she taught Saifi to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and independence of spirit, forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. So, in addition to the Eurocentric bias of this text, there also is a Christian bias in this text. And Saifi's father loathed the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian. One of the things that I've always found interesting is that Saifi basically decides to run off on her own to join her love, and that happens to be Felix. And that shows a great level of strength and independence on her part. She can't even speak the language. So again, I think that this is a way that Mary Shelley is perhaps asking us to think about gender in unconventional ways for the time period. Of course, this also gives us the plot possibility of the creature being able to learn language, because the family has to teach, the DeLacy family has to teach Saifi English. So the creature can hide and basically learn from those lessons as well. Again, Mary Shelley isn't always the smoothest of writers. And this happens in chapter 15, where the creature says, "Soon after my arrival in the hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress, which I had taken from your laboratory," indicating that not only has the creature learning how to speak, but also is learning how to read. And that the creature is not just reading some text that it just coincidentally came upon, but also it is reading its own history, which gets us to the epistolary novel technique again, that we basically are given information through letters, which is again problematic because it complicates the authenticity of the narrative. How reliable is that narrative if we aren't getting a direct account? But I always thought, too, that the epistolary novel serves as documentation. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to Dracula, and that you've got a written record of what's occurred. So, in some ways, ironically, it might lead to a certain level of validity, even though, as we had established with Walton, we're only getting his interpretation of the events that are given to him, and he's not in a particularly good physical or emotional state. And he's recording those incidents hours after he's been told about them. So all of that leads to this complicated narrative. And some of you had asked about a Frankenstein that might be a little bit more accurate to the text itself. I always recommend the 1990s Robert De Niro and Kenneth Branagh film version. If nothing else, we get a more accurate appearance of the creature itself. And as we go on, the creature asks, this is in chapter 13, "Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base?" And the answer is, oh yeah. And of course, the creature is going to realize this over and over again. And says in chapter 16, "Only on you," he's talking about Victor, "had I any claim for pity or redress." Victor being the creator, the kind of father figure. And what Victor says in chapter 19, he says, "I felt as if I had committed some great crime. I was guiltless, but I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head." I can't help but smile because Victor has committed a great crime. And even though Victor, at the beginning of the novel, talks about how ultimately he wants to give Walton this narrative to serve as a cautionary tale for narrative, we see how Victor vacillates throughout the text by not taking responsibility for his actions. When the creature says in chapter 20 to Victor that, I shall be with you on your wedding night, after Victor refuses to create a mate for it. Of course, Victor, in his hubris, assumes that that means the creature will be attacking him, Victor. But of course, the best way to hurt somebody is to hurt someone that person loves. So what we get is the murder of Elizabeth, and then also the murder of Clerval, which many have noted that his relationship with Henry Clerval is quite close, very intimate, perhaps even more so than anything that he has with Elizabeth. Some have even suggested homoerotic elements between them. I don't know if there's necessarily evidence in the text to suggest that, but certainly during the Romantic period, it was much more common to be openly expressive of feelings. And of course, when Victor negates his responsibility to the creature is going to retaliate. And not only does Victor abandon the creature, but then Victor promises to create a mate and then doesn't do so. And through rationalizing that perhaps they would breed. And again, this is something I have to chuckle about. If Victor has the ability to create life from death, I suspect he has the ability to create a female who is infertile. But nevertheless, even if that were not possible, we know that Victor continually makes excuses and oftentimes uses these excuses to rationalize his behavior. In chapter 24 is when we get finally the return to Walton. So this is a circular narrative, and I'm hopeful that you're coming to the ending of reading this text if you haven't already done so. And I'm also hopeful that you are going to begin, if you haven't done so, reading our next text, in that we will be transitioning over to Edgar Allan Poe for a couple classes. And as we're talking about Edgar Allan Poe, this is when I'm hopeful that you will, of course, be reading the following text in the syllabus. But that said, I've also assigned several class sessions to each of the major texts so that there is time for you to read and catch up if necessary, if you're not able to complete it by the first class session that is assigned for that particular text. When in chapter 24, Victor says to this mutinous crew, remember, Walton is proceeding and the crew doesn't want to, even though it's much too dangerous. Victor says to the crew, be men or be more than men. Be steady to your purposes and firm as a rock. This goes against everything that Victor was saying at the beginning of the tale, where he was telling Walton not to make the same mistakes Victor had and not to be filled with hubris. Now Victor is telling the crew to continue on this dangerous mission regardless of the consequences, which again is a great example of Victor's vacillation throughout, as we will see, the entire text. And in chapter 24, the creature talks a little bit about how impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested, yet could not disobey. And servitude and mastery, slavery and mastery, the interesting idea in this text, something that, again, you might perhaps want to pursue in a journal or you might want to pursue in a paper. And then in chapter 24, the creature says, I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable frame. That now that Victor is dead, the creature doesn't see any reason to continue on. So therefore, it's going to commit suicide, though we never actually see the suicide itself. So that's, of course, very different than what we see in the Hollywood film, where the creature is destroyed and there is this return to normalcy or seeming normalcy with our, quote, happy, unquote, ending. Of course, that would have been part of Hollywood code at the time, that the monster would be destroyed. But I also think that it's also very Hollywood to try to provide a happy ending regardless of code. These texts from Gothic authors aren't necessarily feel-good texts. If there's anything positive about Mary Shelley's text, is that it would be through Walton, that he decides to turn around and perhaps he will not make the same mistakes Victor makes, that perhaps this was a learning opportunity for Walton. And if we can take that further, ultimately the hope is that it's a learning opportunity for us, and that we will not try to defy the gods or to be so filled with hubris and arrogance that we ultimately destroy ourselves and those around us. There's a quote from, of all things, Jurassic Park that I love to cite at this point. Just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. And I've always said that Frankenstein should be read by every science major, that the ability to create something doesn't necessarily mean that one should create, whether you want to see that from a scientific perspective or whether you just want to think about that in terms of procreation. But I do think about the creators of the atom bomb indicated that if they understood the way that it would have been used, they never would have pursued that endeavor. But at any rate, some of these topics were discussed in the discussion forum, so I encourage you to read my comments, not just to your particular response about a, for instance, important quote. And that said, there are many important quotes, and I'll also be talking more about quotes next class, though I've given you a few today. But to read my responses to your classmates as well, and you'll get a very good sense of what it is we would have talked about in class and would be talking about in class. Um, as I've suggested for several paper topics, I last class had uploaded in our syllabus and other documents folder some information about the paper, which won't be due anytime soon, but you have the option of writing your paper on Frankenstein. So I wanted you to begin to contemplate ideas, but you can come up with your own topic as well, as long as you have it approved by me. And more importantly, perhaps just because it's earlier in our semester, is that we have journals. And your first journal is going to be about Frankenstein. And that will be due this upcoming Wednesday on the 28th by 11:59 p.m. I ask that you send that via PDF, because that's how my grading program works best, to my email, Ruiz, Ruiz, at gcc.mass.edu, about a page or so response in reference to Frankenstein. That said, your journal can be as long or as short as you would like it to be, but I'm thinking about a page or so of thoughts, reflections. Certainly, you can reference the information from the class videos and from the discussion forums, as well as your own observations as well. And you might end up using the journal as a kind of springboard to try out an idea for a paper, so that also is a possibility. Not that the journals have to be connected in any way to the papers, they can be two separate entities. And throughout the course of the semester, you'll be handing in these journals for each of the major Gothic texts that we'll be reading. So at the ending of the semester, you should have a nice commentary of reflections about all of the Gothic works that we've addressed. I will be evaluating it informally. I think of it as a kind of conversation on paper. Sometimes people use the term journal to mean something like diary, and I think that they're very similar. The difference is that a diary is about your personal life, while these journal reflections would be your personal reflections, but about the text itself. And because it's informal, I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. I see it as a kind of conversation on paper, and I grade it on a check mark system, with a plus being excellent and a check plus being very good, a check being satisfactory. That's usually where most of the grades are. There also is a less than satisfactory, that's a check minus, and a minus, which is an unsatisfactory. So, what I wanted to do was to put some closure onto Frankenstein on Wednesday. So, that might perhaps assist you with your journal, though certainly you can hand in the journals early. And if you are feeling like you've got enough to say about Frankenstein, you can hand in your journal about Frankenstein at any point now. For today's discussion question, I thought we could talk about the way that the novel is constructed. As I've talked about, this epistolary novel about giving a story through letters rather than through direct narration. And my question to you, and it's again a question for which there is no right or wrong answer, because I'm more interested in your reasoning process than the actual answer itself. Did you like or dislike Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique in the novel Frankenstein, and why? Did you like or dislike Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique in Frankenstein, and why? Of course, a technique that was not used in the 1930s film. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will put some closure onto Frankenstein next class. Take care. Bye bye.